The sheet that you signed in on the door, I don't want you to sign your timing again, but could you just tick off if you're actually here? And if you want to join our LinkedIn group so you can see what the activity is of our program, bigger screen address. Okay, so that's the first one. And the second announcement is please watch our website feature talk. We've got a very interesting program coming up. Really till April as well. I'm sure you can remind me what it is. It's going to talk about the group. If you're in the program, it would be better when the speakers talk. That could be the job. That could be the okay. If you're not in the program, right. We're expecting a lot more. It's my very, very pleasure to I'm sure you understand what he says, and he'll probably tell you all himself. David has had a pretty distinguished career as a senior academic, and also a senior member of the project team in a number of large organisations, shall I say that? You'll say more. Yeah. Where he's had leading roles in, of course, so I think we've got a very good reason tonight, and it's very much looking forward to hearing it.
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah. So thanks for inviting me to come along. It's a privilege to come and talk to the programme with some change. I'm going to talk to another group of enterprise architects.
So as Jeff said, a bit about what the career is. So I do have something in that band.
And have worked in the financial services industry for about the last 15 years. And so I hope, as Jeff said, a bit of as a foil. So as he said, my background's a little old. I was actually head of software engineering at the University of Greenwich for about 8 years. So I've got an academic background. I spent the last 15 years as sort of an architect, come designer, come enterprise architecture in a number of institutions. I currently run my own company, which is a small consulting firm working with CIOs, but I ran the retail architecture side of the banking group. And a team of about 300 architects. I ran Capgemini's financial services practice. I've run ABN AMRO, wholesale bank where I ran 6 countries. About 7,500 systems. So I'm used to dealing with quite large, complex problems. Typically around integrated technologies and thinking about where people are starting to move their IT vision. And Jeff quite kindly asked me to come along and talk a little bit about enterprise architecture. And I thought I'd do this in 2 stages. One, talk a little bit about my view of enterprise architecture, as we go through the talk. And then I thought I'd try and put just put along about concepts. And actually building a vision is actually progress through this moment in terms of a number of clients I'm actually working with where certainly in terms of the financial services industry, we're trying to work out how this new world that's out there called a branch meets financial services industry and how to integrate our customers. And it's turning out quite traumatic when you go into business because they really don't get it. And I'm trying to articulate why they really don't get it, and it's also quite painful. So I'm sitting down with the CEO of my current client a couple of weeks time why he doesn't get it. It's always an interesting one because either means I'll be working with next week and doing some work So first question is, what do we mean by enterprise architecture? And this is where the problem starts. Because if you get a bunch of enterprise architects and ask this question, you'll get an open answer from everybody. And this is really part of the problem associated with how enterprise architecture started to grow for years. You go to different companies and you have a different perception of what it is you actually do. So in order to get recognition, I cheated. I googled it, and that was the wiki. Quite a complex one. It's a practice applying a comprehensive, rigorous method. Come back to that in a minute. For describing how structure for an organisation's processes, information systems, personnel, and organisational subunits. So they align with the organisation's core goals and direction. It tells me one thing. There's more than technology in enterprise architecture. And enterprise architecture directly is more about transforming businesses than it is just about technology. That's a very complex step, a very difficult skill set that you need when you call yourself an enterprise architect. And it requires a very specific skills to manage and maintain credibility in terms of building these companies. I was doing a podcast to schools about when I said, well, we spend about 20% of my time doing technology, and 80% of my time running around being an That's my job. I go around and I mediate and I sell things with no reason. I do what I do. I regard it from that. Sometimes I do a technologist. Which is interesting because the path that we have for the development of the skills that we talk about when we develop enterprise architects, generally what you do is you take good programmers and you promote them up through the supply chain. How many people have ever met a communicative good programmer? Opposite end of the skill set, good programmer, communication, don't know. So part of the problem here is just understanding how we get the people with the right skill sets that can actually start to sort of develop these roles and do these roles in organisations. And I think they are still quite scarce in the market, which has an upside. It doesn't mean that we're popular. For a number of reasons. And really over the last couple of years, enterprise architecture has really started to evolve around this idea of business transformation. So you can set yourself a set of objectives around it, eh? It's about IT delivers best value in support of business objectives. Sounds pretty woolly, but pretty much what we do. Ensure sustainability by building consensus across the organisation. It's really quite an important role, driving the organisation forward, driving a consensus about where the technology is going. Especially in organisations these days where everybody's got an opinion. And part of the problem is I think a lot of people are used to using technology at home. Everybody uses a PC, everybody surfs the internet, they're familiar with Facebook, they use productivity tools on the desktop. Everybody thinks they know what IT is about. And there's nothing worse than going into an organisation where you're sitting down with some of the senior managers and you're talking about why it's going to take you 2 years to deliver a system, and they go, well, I could do it on my desktop in half an hour. Why is it going to take 2 years? This whole break, I think, in terms of the disconnect that's starting to appear between what we try to do as enterprise architects and people's perception of the real problems that we're trying to solve when they're delivering these complex structures. So from my perspective, and this is my view rather than anybody else's, what is it that we try and do when we start to put together an architecture? And it starts with a very simple view of the world. What issues does my architecture address? If you can't answer those questions, what it is you're trying to solve and what's the problem, you're not going to align your enterprise architecture to anything that sits within the business. And this is part of the crucial question around what it is you're trying to get out of that process. How do you measure success? Because there's nothing worse than going back to your boss in a year's time and going, well, I've built an enterprise architecture. How successful was it? Well, I've built an enterprise architecture. You're going to be able to measure it. Do you understand the maturity of the organisation, the maturity of the technology you're trying to bring to bear? Do you know what assets you've got, what value you're bringing to the business? These are all things that help you sort of start to articulate what value you're going to bring by being an enterprise architect. Can't do that, you've got a very short career span. I've seen a number of enterprise architecture organisations now fold because they can't ask those questions. And especially when times are tough, and people are really worried about money, the first thing they do is they cut all the strategic stuff. So unless you can show how you deliver value, you're going to have a very short lifespan. So if you can understand the question, what issues does my EA address, and I'll try and do that in the context of this mobile piece that we look at later. You've then got the second question of, what does my enterprise architecture look like? And if you remember my previous slide, it's not just about technology, this is about process, this is about governance, this is about driving the architecture through. This is about what capabilities you provide, what services you're going to provide. It's quite a sort of people, process and technology picture rather than just a raw technology picture on its own. Yeah. But you'll be working through things like governance, you'll be working through things like how you manage all your projects, what the project lifecycle should look like. Oh, the business process. That's secondary here at the moment. We haven't even got that far yet. We're still talking about what you set up from an enterprise architecture perspective, rather than just looking at the business processes. Yeah, that's a second layer to your, when you start to look at problem solving. And then the last one on the layer here is, how will I deliver my enterprise architecture? Have I got the right people? Have I got the right processes? And these are the people and processes internal to the IT organization. The business organization actually interacts with IT. I've always regarded these three layers as being quite crucial to delivering enterprise architecture. And the nice thing about enterprise architecture is that you can go out and you can look for a framework that helps you describe your enterprise architecture. So TOGAF might be one of those, and it will lay out things like a business architecture, information architecture, architecture. But alongside that, we've got this framework for delivering governance, management. How are you going to start to articulate strategy? How are you going to start to make sure you've got sustainability across the organisation? How are you going to develop the capability? And certainly within the enterprise architect space and the organisation, how are you going to build a community? How are you going to manage and govern that whole idea that these people work as part of an organisation and they all buy into the journey that we're trying to take these people on? So a lot of the success behind a successful enterprise architecture practice doesn't have a lot to do with the technology side. It has a lot to do with how you drive it through the organisation, how you set it up and how you enable it. And I sort of spend a fairly large chunk of my time over here rather than on the technology side, explaining to people why the decision that I took last week is something that they should follow through with. And then sitting down with them next week and explaining why the decision I took 2 weeks ago is the one they should follow through with. It's also about making sure that you've got the right, as I say, the right audit and governance, you've got the right structures in place to ensure that the decisions that you take are driven through the organisation, and that within the organisation, if you change that, you've got a way of auditing that and picking it up and making sure you understand the impact on your organisation. It's very much a two-way flow of information that sits across the organisation. And really, part of the value or the tasks that we get involved in around creating the strategy is understanding the assets that we have and understanding what tools and techniques we need to bring into supporting that decision-making process. That's a very different thing to simply just sitting down and looking at the technology itself. So
I just wanted to ask, why do you think there's a general attitude towards enterprise architecture? It's quite common to get organisations don't fully appreciate it. What's the general cause?
Because it doesn't show value. Sorry? Because it doesn't show value.
And why is that?
Because enterprise architects on the whole think that
what the technology should look like,
perhaps in a year or 2 years' time,
and really lose the focus on adding value to those projects. So for me,
an enterprise architect has really got to be able to show they can add value to projects. If you can't do that, what you're doing is you're creating something that actually nobody's really interested in. So you very soon become disenfranchised within the organisation. So unless you are looking at the long term, but very much focused on the short term, and working out how you help move the organisation forward, you will get no traction. The second part of the problem is articulating why you think things should be done in a particular way. So I'll give you an example. My current client, I started work with them probably about May last year. And the management team sat above the IT group, had a view about what they wanted us to go and have a look at. They said, we want you going to look at that bit of the organisation over there, we think that's broken. So I sat down with the team and we actually gathered a whole lot of MI. We gathered a whole lot of data about the organisation.
About technology, about systems, about run costs,
etc. And after about 5 months, I sat down with the CEO of the organisation and said, you're asking us the wrong question. What do you mean I'm asking you the wrong question? And we just put the data in front of him and said, you want us to look at that piece of the organisation there. It's not broken. That bit of the organisation up there is broken. And because we could put the data in front of him, where his run costs were, he went, okay, go fix. But if we've not had the MI to go and do that, he would have just looked at us and said, well, you know, you're not giving me the data that I need to understand why you've made that decision. So part of the game around enterprise architecture is, it's about the information that you can bring to bear to try and measure or put some real facts behind what you're talking about. And most architecture groups don't do that. So I'm a great believer in science over conjecture. And it might be because I'm a physicist by training rather than a computer scientist by training. So if I've got a problem to solve, and I think I'm going to have a problem articulating that answer, I'll go and get as much data as I can to prove my point. And that, I think, is something that a lot of architecture teams don't do. To some extent, we don't have the tools and techniques to allow us to do that. That's, I think, is the other side of the coin. So this for me is very much about collecting all that data and then making use of it. And it was a very simple picture. We went in and said, you're spending 30% of your money there, you only think you're spending 10%. And here's the facts and figures why. So I think that's part of the problem, is this whole Ivy Tower piece that sits around a lot of architecture practices. And it sort of does come back to that skill of being a consultant. Any consultants in the room? Anybody's done consulting? Yeah, sort of. I mean, you know as well as I do, if you're not effective in the first week or two, people will start questioning what you're there for. And this is the same thing with enterprise architecture. You've got to be effective early on. You've got to understand what you're doing for your stakeholders. You've got to provide support for your key stakeholders. Otherwise, you'll lose that traction within the organisation. Yeah.
Your question, don't you?
Yeah.
In terms of what you said, how growth development controls. And that's part of the problem, isn't it? But they're just measuring the cost of this huge stuff. So,
no, but that's one dimension. Yeah, but it's understanding how you overlay those different dimensions. So you can do a cost overlay, you could do a non-cost overlay, you could do a value overlay. You could build it along ways depending on the question you've been asked. But this particular one, because we were talking about simplifying the estate, and we were certainly being asked to look at run costs, it was the right decision, it was the right thing to go back with. But if we'd have been asked a different question, I'd have put a different overlay over it. So it's more about how you create that model, and how you get your information together to support your argument that's crucial, not just that you might be focusing on one particular dimension. So there's a sort of this whole non-technology piece that I think that sits around that whole enterprise architecture work that we actually do. So again, it means that, for me anyway, the skill sets associated with being an effective EA is very different to the sorts of things we have if we're a programmer or if we're a designer. So perhaps I'm part diplomat, part economist, part whatever. And then on top of that, if I'm doing proper enterprise architecture, I also need to understand the business. So if I'm talking to a business line around why they need a piece of technology, they expect me to understand their business line, as well as everything else. I think always. Yeah, no, I think the real challenge here is when you start to look at the different ways in which IT is developed. So when I started in financial services quite a while ago, I started in investment banking. And if you didn't understand the business, you got about 2 minutes with the business people before they throw you out the door. Their idea of a requirement on a trading floor would be, here's a one-liner and I want that.
That's all you've ever got out of it, because they expect you to know the business. They said,
You don't want to go build it. So very quickly, if you're in this business transformation game, you really do need to understand the business. Because as an enterprise architect, you will challenge them on their model. And that's an uncomfortable position to be in for people.
Which really means that if you're going to be an enterprise architect, you have to come with an extremely large skill set.
Yeah.
Basically, you're saying that an enterprise architect is a management himself, and knows what he's talking about.
Not always. Yeah. Well, a management consultant knows what he's talking about, yeah. But I think the challenge is just that skill set you need to build. So I regard myself as actually being quite fortunate. I started 32 years ago as a hardware engineer. And I've done hardware, I've done software development, I spent 10 years teaching. I've studied most software life cycles around, I programmed in a lot of languages. I spent the last 15 years doing design and EA. There aren't that many people that have had that breadth. And when you look at where the new kids on the block are coming from, that skill set is actually quite hard to acquire. And just to compound things, the shape of enterprise architecture has changed. And the shape of the way in which IT organisations interact has changed. So typically, 20 years ago, enterprise architecture operated within a fairly narrow scope within the organisation. And then we started changing things. We started doing things like outsourcing system. We didn't buy stuff anymore, we bought packages off of people. We started to work with third-party providers, software as a service. All of these things now start to compound the nature of the relationship you have between you and the technology that runs within the business. So if I'm setting up a project in my current client, not only have I got to talk to the in-house developers, I've got to talk to 3 or 4 vendors, 3 or 4 package providers. I've got people providing those services to me rather than just all being in-house. I've got a fairly large chunk of it offshore in India. So this whole idea of coordination and management becomes quite more complex because you haven't got everybody in the same building, and you've got to herd a lot more elements to the overall architecture because you've got a lot more moving parts associated with it. And this makes it a completely different structure to the way in which you might establish a project. Because now I'm going to do some sourcing strategy. I'm going to decide the best way to decide how to deliver a project. It might be in-house, it might be third party, it might be offshore. I've got to build the models around that. So this is really starting to fundamentally, I think, shift the way in which, again, the skill set is pressured in terms of the way in which architects actually function within an organisation.
Worked on a project 2 years ago in a blue bank, and we had
13 vendors on the programme, as well as the in-house development team. So coordinating that lot and working out how your architecture is going to fit becomes quite tricky. Because everybody has their own agenda, everybody has their own architecture. So it's actually becoming quite a complex problem in terms of working out how you get those moving parts together. And it's getting worse. What's making it worse is the internet. Because now some of those areas that you might have had control of before are starting to break quite dramatically, especially driven by some of the technologies that are coming along. But because we've got this notion that we're dealing with complex problems, you have to break the problem down.
Most methodologies in the world now start to talk about
various layers that exist within the architecture.
And
these layers of abstraction exist in things like TOGAF. When I was at CAP, we had it was called IF. But fundamentally, everybody breaks these things down now into certainly conceptual, logical, and physical. So you've got to learn all these terms, and you've got to learn what sort of level of detail we should put in each of these layers. But I always add one over the top, which is contextual, which is everything you do lives within a context. And if the context changes, a lot of the decisions that you take could also change. So understanding the context is quite important in understanding why you've driven particular elements of the architecture for that particular solution.
that makes
Quite hard.
Because
Because
modeling
modeling
context
context
is
is
not
something we're very good at. And the reason for that is, I think something. Anybody familiar with Claudio Sabora? Anybody read some of his books? Sabora? Shame. One of the things that quite a few of the academics have recognised over the years is actually that IS is not a technology discipline, it's a hybrid discipline.
It's got a bit of socialist to it. And it's more of a social technical system.
It's just a purely technical system. And it's fuzzy, it's not really black and white. And the problem is that a lot of the tools that we bring to bear, when we talk about doing program design, are quite hard and formal in their discipline. They're not used to dealing with fuzzy problems. So this idea of an entity relationship graph, or some of these mathematical abstractions that we use, they're all things that expect the real world to be really hard and deep. It's not. It's actually quite fuzzy. So we've got a problem in the sense that a lot of the tools that we use have a good level of suitability up to a certain point within an architecture, and then they break down.
So again, we've got this gap that exists between the formal methods we use around programming and systems design and the ways in which we want to analyse an organisation,
or the ways in which we want to look at context.
So this is
leading to, I think, quite a challenge for enterprise architects to understand how you start to model those more complex systems. At Capgemini a few years ago, a couple of friends of mine sort of recognised this, and Blackwood Nigel Green wrote a book called Lost in Translation. Have you read it? No. It's all about this big gap, what we used to call the IT divide. And he put together a thinking framework called VPET-T that we've used quite successfully to start to analyse the high levels of the organisation and the way people interact and the stakeholders and the value systems that drive them,
to understand
why it is that when you're doing these broader analyses for enterprise architecture, things can actually start to break down. And that was actually because they were, at the time, looking at the criminal justice system. And the breakdown that was happening in terms of how they were trying to build a very well-structured IT system that ran from police stations to prisons with courts and lawyers and everything else in the middle. And they found a big disconnect between the different value systems and the different processes that drove each of those elements of the organisation. So, for instance, the lawyers and the CPS wanted absolute quality and definition around those cases. They wanted that information to be really good. Whereas the police were incentivised on just getting everybody into the jails and shooting out the system. The data quality for them wasn't actually really important. They had a different set of criteria. So the chain itself was broken when you think about how they were starting to look at how those IT systems were actually going to interact. And you can say the same of some of the big NHS failures, where people failed to understand the different value systems that drove the way in which people interacted with their little fragments of IT that represented the entire chain in a case when you were seeing a doctor or things that came off the back. So Quite interesting. And I use it all the time. So the first thing I do, any organisation I walk into, is build that stakeholder map. What's driving each individual? What do they want from their IT? Are they going to conflict with that person over there? How do you then start to bring that together in terms of understanding the way in which you bring those different elements of the organisation together? So that whole idea of understanding people in terms of understanding how you build a longer-term strategy for the way in which the IT within an organisation should really start to come together. Yep.
You know, you spoke about multi-vendor platforms, especially when they're outsourced.
Yeah.
You know, say like you've got a BSV or shared database, which multi-vendors will use. What's the approach you would recommend inside architect?
In terms of sort of bringing together the technologies? I'll get everybody in one room. The first thing you've got to do is get everybody on the same page, make sure everybody talks the same language, because they don't. Yeah. Well, if you're doing an outsourcing deal, but even then, you know, you've got to make sure that if your vendors aren't aligned or prepared to work with each other, you've got a problem. And if they're all competing vendors, you're still going to bring them together in a room for a project and say, you will work together on this. And that's part of the challenge around enterprise architecture, is trying to bring together those different people and cultures to make sure they operate correctly. And if you can't do that, if you don't recognise those differences, then you won't get your projects driven out the door. I'll give you an example. So I was out in Hong Kong a few years ago, working with a bank out in there, and they had an Indian offshore provider delivering the software. Now, the culture was very different between the English guys running the bank in Hong Kong and the software provider, which was a Delhi-based company. And you had to bring those two cultures together. And typically, no offence to the Indian guys in the room, you know, because the cultures were different, we drove the software lifecycle around how we would deal with those cultural differences. So it's recognising the fact that there isn't one size fits all. You can't take a standard process out, you've got to modify it. I had a big meeting.
A couple of suppliers of mine last week sat them in a room and said, I want you to work on this together.
I know you're competing in certain elements of the market, but as far as I'm concerned, you're one team. If you're not prepared to be one team, the door with a supplier of mine, well, in fact, a couple of suppliers of mine last week, it's not going to work. So part of that process of being an enterprise architect is, as I said, it's being a Kofi Annan. It's actually going out and sort of bashing heads together occasionally.
Does it help to have some kind of like technology and principles that you sign up?
Yeah, for every project, I'll always have a core architecture and a set of principles that everything needs to adhere to. So you've got to have your standards, you've got to have your principles, you've got to say this is the shape in which I want everything to hold to. But you've got to set that vision when you've got multiple vendors. But then you've got to get them in a room and line them up and say, do you all buy into it? This is the way we're going. Just as much as you would have to do that with your own internal development teams. You've really got to get people to sign into the vision, otherwise it will break. If people don't sign up, don't underestimate just how hard that can be to get it back on track. I learned that one the hard way. I was working for, in fact, I was working for ABN AMRO. I got a project team together in the Netherlands to do a global project, and I had people from Chicago and Singapore and everything else all in the room.
And I've been with major stakeholders to build that consensus, and everybody on site walked into the room.
A nice presentation about where the project was going, what it was going to do.
And the junior DA on the project in back to the room,
I disagree.
Now, if anybody's worked with the Dutch, then
That's fatal.
because they're
They're
very
very consensus-driven people.
And
because it was a Dutch bank, I couldn't fire him.
Because that's the way the
Dutch working system was functioning at the time.
So
I had to go around and rebuild all the consensus again because I lost it in the room. And it took me 2 months to do that. Chicago, Singapore, back to New York,
got it all going,
the same people back in the same room, same presentation, got it all through fine. Went back to London. What did my boss say to me? He didn't get my comment actually. But.
So for me, architecture is just about you really got to understand what drives those organisations, what value
systems by those individual groups, understand how you bring them together.
If you don't get that consensus, whether it's internal or
external.
Yeah. You said that was using that BA. Was it because the question you asked was the correct one, or was it because you know right now?
No, it was very simple. I didn't understand what.
Everybody else did, because I walked everybody else through it. Because he hadn't seen it before, he didn't understand it, put his hand up, raised the question, threw everybody out, and it took me a long time to go back and reorganise it again.
So does that mean that it's important to get made?
Absolutely. Because
I've seen so many times where you don't get the
programmers on board as part of your vision, they may do something that breaks it.
So
But you've really got to understand how you start to get all those stakeholders in place and drive it through.
It may not be you, it may be that as part of the team structure, but you make sure that the people that work with you are
working that vision through. Unless you maintain that consistency, anything can break it. And that's the challenge when you've got these large projects. That's right. Can you repeat the question? Yeah. So, for instance, with the current role, I work for the CIO. I don't work in any of those. So the level at which we operate is at the very top of the organisation. Some of the architects I've got, we sit as a separate group. You've got a project office out there, you have to go and work with the project office. So, you know, when I incept a project, you have to go and get all of those people lined up, you have to get everybody in a room, make sure that you understand everything that's going on, they're all brought into it. So you've really got to manage each of those different groups because they all have a different agenda. And typically within the projects within an organisation, if you go and talk about strategic bits of technology in a project, they'll go crazy. Because the first thing the project manager says is, well, how am I going to deliver that? Why me? Why not somebody else? Let them deliver that bit of strategy. I just want to deliver this bit. Really sort of those and bring them together. So really for me, it's about understanding what you're trying to deliver from a contextual perspective to make sure that you've got your business objectives lined up. And then it's understanding if you're driving through a vision and you're driving through a series of projects, everybody's bought into that overall journey. And the bigger the organisation, the longer it takes. But at the same time, you've got to balance this view that you can't go off 2 years, put yourself in the cupboard and not deliver anything. You've got to be immediate in the projects to make sure that people think you're delivering value. And if you're not, that's where you'll get back to this idea that most EA practices are actually not looked at as being strategic or value-driven. In fact, a lot of organisations I visit, the EA team are seen as being in the way, not part of the game. And that's a very dangerous position to be in. So talked a lot about a lot of different concepts. So let's try and put it in some sort of shape by just looking at an example. And it's a particularly close one for me at the moment, as I said, because it's something that I'm looking at in terms of the current role that I'm playing in a number of organisations. Mobile. Everybody knows what mobile looks like. There's one I prepared earlier. It's an old one actually, it's a 3G as well. It's I'm not too sure I will do. So this is about understanding the strategy you need to put in place if you're going to deliver a mobile offering as an organisation. So what's the biggest challenge, do you think, around this? Simple device, nice and small memory, easy to program on. What's the problem? Yeah. What do I write for? I'm setting up a strategy for an organisation. We're going to have a mobile channel in our organisation. iPhone, Android, Windows, yeah. Which platform do I choose? And more importantly, what technology sits within that? Because there's a variety of technologies out there. Made really hard by the pace at which things move and the pace at which things change. What drives that change? Us. We are fickle, and we change our minds, and we like things one minute and we don't like things the next. So I thought I'd have a quick look at just the history of the smartphone. Apple unveiled the smartphone, effectively,
in January 2007.
A certain Steve Ballmer said the most expensive phone in the world, not really going to hit the market too much, not really become popular because it's too popular. And at this time, Microsoft had about 18% of the market in mobile phones, in terms of technology. So April 2007, Windows Mobile has about 18% share of the market. November 2007, Google announces Android and you can have it for free. Steve Ballmer says, we're not bothered, we've got a Windows platform, we've got millions of customers. October 2008, iPhone has 13% share of the market, RIM has 15%. Microsoft clearly are going down. November 2008, Android-based G1 launches, so that's basically the first Android-based mobile phone in the market, smartphone in the market. December 2008, despite just over a year before Steve Ballmer saying, I'm not worried, he kills the current Windows mobile platform. That's about 18 months from going, I'm not bothered, to, oops, I'm going to go do something different because the market's moved. Autumn 2009, BlackBerry RIM has 20% market share. Interesting one. 4 years ago. April 2010, Android had 10% market share. So 2 years before where we are today. October 2010, Microsoft sort of announced Windows 8 phone, something like that. April 2011, despite Steve Ballmer saying they'll never sell any phones, that particular quarter, or that particular year, Apple sold 18.6 million smartphones. Are they significant in the market? Whoops, yeah. Samsung sold 17.5 million, and Android's now up at 36% of market share. July 2011, Android's gone from 36% to 43%. So which platform am I developing on? I'm not doing it on Windows anymore. I might be doing it on Android. And in September 2011, Windows 8 preview. November 2011, Android's now running 50% of the market for smartphones. October 2012, Windows Phone hits the market. January 2013, Firefox hit the market. Anybody seen the Firefox announcement? No? Another mobile phone. Another mobile platform. Yeah, I almost missed it as well, and it was sort of just flashed through on the BBC website. So there's about a 4-year cycle there of radical change in the market in terms of technology. And just to make life easy, did a bit of a count up. You've got Symbian, you've got BlackBerry, you've got Android, you've got iOS, you've got Windows, you've got Palm OS, you've got Barda, all still sitting around in the market. Technology-wise, you've got a choice. You can use Java, you can use Objective-C, you can use C++, you've got a Linux platform in there with Android, and underpinning that, you've got a thing called WebKit as well. Anybody know what WebKit is? It's basically the engine that drives most of the browsers out in the market now. And of course, running along the bottom there, very quiet, very unnoticed, HTML5 and CSS3. Sharp outsider. So if I was to sort of create a strategy that said, right, okay, we're going to develop for BlackBerry, Android, iOS, Windows 8, I'll ignore all the others for now, and I'm going to do tablet and phone, and if it's Android, I might have to do about half a dozen because they've all got different form factors and they all look slightly different. I could end up building 15 different platforms with the same functionality. So which one do I choose? Thank you. So the challenge here is, when you start to think about the context, you need to do your homework. You need to understand whether or not you're committing the organization to a technological dump. And that's a real challenge because this particular market is moving so rapidly. And it gets worse because you've got bring your own device or choose your own device, depending on where you are. So for a lot of organizations now, they probably won't know what the users are going to bring in as a device to actually operate within the organization. You've got this device convergence. A 5-inch screen on an iPhone versus a 7-inch screen on a tablet. Are they different? Are they not? Where they're going? Customers, I think, in the next couple of years will want to set their own UI. They want to create their own view of the world because they're getting smart. They understand how to use these tools. So how do you create a customer mashup? Once you start to really proliferate these devices and you want to do different things in different places, how do you make sure that you've got the right level of trust associated with customers using those devices? So for instance, get my card out. I should have done this earlier, shouldn't I? I should have done a bit of a prep. Contactless debit card. How many people have got a contactless debit card? How many people really use it that often? Why not? You don't trust it. Yeah, and a lot of people don't trust them. Yeah, everybody in the banking industry is going, oh, this is the way forward. And the customers are going, no. So if I then put that card on that device there, are you still going to trust it? You want banking on your mobile? Barclays did a really good job last year when they announced mobile payments on a mobile. It's not mobile payments on a mobile. What it is, it's one of those stuck to the back of one of those. It's not mobile payments. Not yet, anyway. So trust is actually quite a big problem because people need to be able to trust the services you put out on those devices. And for a lot of people, having everything on the mobile is really great. It's really convenient. Because you've got a one-stop shop. I've got all my friends on there in Facebook. I've got all my financial transactions on there. And then I flush it down the loo. How many people do I ring up to get that fixed? So the technology map here is actually quite hard to decide exactly what you're going to put where and whether people will actually use it. Processes. So we'll come back to your point about when you start to think about processes as part of the strategy. So a couple of weeks ago, I sat down with my business and said, your processes are all wrong. You've got processes that talk about servicing customers in branch. You can't use those on a mobile. Oh, can't you? No. So you've got to reinvent the business when you go mobile. So now you've got to go and have a process discussion with your business, not a technology discussion with your business. As we've talked about, you just can't afford to put everything everywhere. It's just not going to happen. It's too expensive. So what compromises do you make? There might be HTML5, but we'll talk about that in a minute. What about cloud and hosting services? They're going to have to integrate with your mobile channel. So it gets quite complex when you think about all the things that establish the context for which you're going to put that strategy together. Let alone the fact that everything's moving at such a pace that I can't keep pace with the technology. So it makes an interesting picture around what it is you're trying to do for the organization. This is a quote from a guy called Brett King, who's quite well known in the financial services industry as a bit of a maverick. And he's written a couple of books, a book called Bank 2.0, which came out about 5 years ago, and then this new one that came out late last year called Bank 3.0. And typically, banks are very conservative. So I go to quite a few companies and they go, well, we're not going to be innovative, we're going to be a fast follower. And you say, do you realize the consequences of what you've just said? So here's an example. If you're a fast follower and you're watching for your competition to start to make money out of that proposition, how far behind are you going to be? When you do the math, you're 4 years behind in the market. In a typical IT with an IT organization, it typically turns around 24 months projects. 4 years is the time it took for Facebook to hit 500 million users. How long did it take HMV to go from being top on the high street to being buried? 5 years. Because they didn't really have a good internet offering, they didn't really have a good digital offering out in the market. And when they finally did wake up, they didn't have enough money in the chain to actually recover that position. So this is actually quite a difficult message to bring back to the business in terms of saying, we've done the analysis, we've looked at the context in which we're running, these are the things you've got to contend with. And then let's go and think about the technology. So what are the techniques that I employ? And I think this is something we took, this is the talk we did at the BCS EA group a little while ago. Is I said this is an imprecise fuzzy world. And one of the things that we did when the guys in camp invented VPEC-T was they tried to use it to help us understand a fuzzy world. Myself and Jill, who's on the credits for the deck, we've taken things a little bit further. We've started to look at other ways of looking at complex social technical problems. And we've actually started to lean on ecology. Now, I always hated biology at school, and I always thought as a physicist, you know, I was in the hard sciences, that was always the place that I should end up. But actually, we're starting to find some interesting analogies between ecology and technology. And the one that we've used here is just to look at the idea about communities and habitats. So any new habitat undergoes a number of phases of colonization. And you get this idea of succession, things taking over from other things, until you get the emergence of a dominant community. That creates a stable ecosystem, and then you get the next big disruptive event. So in the dinosaurs, it was probably a meteorite coming down and sort of planting itself in the middle somewhere. So for a particular habitat, you can understand these different phases of succession around how they're actually colonized. So, you know, if you go and look at a new volcanic plateau in Hawaii, you see how that grows over a period of time. And eventually you get the forest, and that's the dominant species that we all understand. You can take a bit of an analogy with technology. Certainly in mobile, you started off with these platform hardware specific structures we had on the early mobiles. We then started to get to higher level constructs like Android, Linux. So they were allowing us to do some stuff that was cross-device, not necessarily cross a huge number, but at least was starting to get us there. We've actually got quite a bit of work going on at the moment around hybrid platforms. And then the question is the new forest HTML5 and CSS3? So you can start to see how these platforms start to colonize the habitat, which is mobile, and how they exploit or are exploited by the people that exist on that habitat. That's actually been quite useful for us in terms of understanding how these things actually grow and where the key elements of the technology are. So this whole mobile space, off the back of that analysis, is you've got a huge diversity of platforms and languages. So that's the good thing, as my old mate used to say, the nice thing about standards is you've got so many to choose from. Yeah. You've got lack of clarity. It's not easy to pin who's going to be the winner. So 2 years ago, who would have bet against Apple on iPhone? Nobody. This year, would you bet against Apple on iPhone? Yeah. It's starting to lose that edge, you know, it's not quite where it used to be. What's going to drive that? Possibly. Yeah. Because it's potentially the dominant next phase of colonization. Yeah? It's going to be the technology that's going to subsume everything else. Eh? Not quite.
That's really what I say. The forest dominates because nothing else can do it.
Yep. So what makes a technology dominate? What makes a technology dominate is its convenience of use and its adoption in the market. So as people think it's the way to solve some of the other issues they're looking at, it will become the dominant technology.
When Facebook first came along, MySpace was widely used. So
Yeah. You knew technologies come along and it just sweeps the market. Yeah. But then there were attributes within Facebook that, as to take your analogy, took that creates that whole umbrella of things it says. That's why it sweeps everything else away. Yeah. Yeah. So the dominant characteristic of this one is the habitat supports it in a way that's cross-platform. So WebKit is the thing that makes HTML5 dominant. Because it's ubiquitous. Eh? It doesn't yet support all of the features. And until it does, it won't be dominant. Absolutely. So anything that you've got within that habitat, you've got a level of symbiosis that exists between those various components. And that's part of the analysis. We haven't shown it here, but that's part of the analysis that we've done, is to look at the symbiosis that exists. So for instance, the take-up of WebKit, for instance, across the major vendors is quite an important element. Because that's a supporting platform that allows the other things to actually grow within that. Yeah. It will do, but as WebKit dominates, you'll find that they actually do start to converge. Just as on the internet, we went to HTML5 because that was the way that dominated. Yeah. So let me come back on that one. Yeah. So lack of clarity. Yeah, and some of us are old enough to remember VHS and Betamax. Yeah. Anybody choose the wrong library? Anybody have to go back and redo all their tapes? So the decision that we took in terms of our architecture was we want to reduce risk. We're not going to say we can choose the dominant platform, but we want to reduce the risk. But to come back to your point, I'll come back to the two in a minute. The route we took was hybrid. Because hybrid allowed us to fix the bits that HTML5 didn't support and do that quite well. It allowed us to drop a number of native components in where we thought HTML5 was really bad. So maps, for instance, you really want to go native on maps. Otherwise, the user experience isn't particularly good. But actually, it allowed us to build the bulk of the functionality in HTML5, which we could port somewhere else. So that's another one. Yeah, let's come back and look at that in a minute. So we did a couple of things. We looked at the different vendors, we looked at the different platforms and said, well, fundamentally, in terms of the way in which we're going to develop through each layer of a platform, whether that's Android or Windows or iOS, we'd use a thing called responsive web design. That allowed you to mediate some of the different form factors, but actually off the same code base. And then we were going to look at driving across the different platform types. We'd look at a hybrid architecture. And yet we did use PhoneGap. Two reasons. One, because it's reasonably well understood. Two, because it's open source. It didn't cost me anything. And I'm cheapy. And it also means that the skills were relatively quite well available at the time. And if you wanted to add any new functionality, I can write a PhoneGap plugin. So it gives me the best of both worlds. Push as much as I can into the HTML, but actually leave as much option open as I can, because I've got a portable platform that I can use across different devices, and I can solve the performance issue by dropping into native if I need to. And as WebKit and HTML5 capabilities increase, you'll find that we'll probably drop a lot more out of the native and back into the core platform. Yeah, it's all about proliferation. Yeah. So if you look at Safari, you look at Firefox, you look at the only person that breaks that is Microsoft at the moment, because they're not a WebKit engine. But that's one of the things that's driving that uptake. Absolutely right. So as part of that analysis of the ecosystem, we went through the whole bit of where are the things that are really going to drive that success through, and some of it was WebKit, some of it was just where we thought HTML5 was moving. So we arrived at quite an interesting position, which was big tick on hybrid architecture rather than pure HTML5. But also then to try and solve this platform proliferation problem in terms of devices, we thought we'd look at this whole idea of write once, run everywhere again. And responsive web design is really starting to come to the fore now. It's something that people are looking at quite a lot. So that was effectively what then drove the principles around the mobile strategy, those two elements. Now that's risk averse for me. I'm not betting on anything too much. I'm sort of betting on HTML5, but yeah. And WebKit. Yeah.
You're also betting on the open, I mean, hardware is now going into an open market. Open collaboration between vendors.
Yeah. And actually most of the technologies that you can deploy in this have gone from being commercial to being open source. So WebKit, PhoneGap, we've got a bit of Accenture Touch in there. That's now gone open source. So actually, the platforms themselves are becoming really open source platforms, which is an interesting movement. So the strategy itself, sat down, sat that, and went, that's probably the way that we want to do it.
To what extent do you think you're losing speed to market in terms of, forget about the responsive design, you could just get a phone profile out more quickly if you thought about that?
Yeah, and I think the challenge at the moment is how many devices do we need to have a look at in terms of delivery. So if we're going to focus on 3 or 4 major devices and no more, I probably wouldn't use responsive design. If I'm going to use 15 or 20, because that may be the way in which we go in the market, I'm going to probably use responsive design. So there's a tipping point. And part of the analysis we're doing at the moment with a couple of our partners is working out where the tipping point is. It seems to be lower than I thought, actually. So the other thing around that is, if I was doing this as a proper software engineer, and I haven't been one for a while, I think about componentization. Because at the moment, these applications are all fairly monolithic. And all the time they're small, not so much of a problem. As they get bigger and bigger, I might want to componentize and reuse stuff. So we're now thinking about, can you actually componentize these architectures to some extent? And that's where the fun begins. So hybrid approaches that we talked about, Cordova, HTML5, and for probably about 80% of the functionality that we would put out, that's probably good enough. User experience is pretty good. You could use something like App Accelerator's Titanium Studio, which takes a completely different approach. It takes JavaScript and compiles it to native. I've seen people do that, but we decided not to. I think because I couldn't face the idea of having to write App Accelerator Titanium Studio in every presentation. So then off the back of that, having made a decision around a number of technologies, we then started to put the principles in place that would drive how people would use those. So using embedded web view using HTML5. So we've basically said, don't go online, don't treat it like a browser, treat it like an application. If you have to go online, it's going to be too slow. Put as much capability into the web view as you can, because that's how we're going to get some of that reuse. Use as many open source frameworks as possible, because I'm cheap. Create an architecture that can be readily ported. So now what we've done is we've said, okay, we've made these technology choices, now let's go and work on the architecture for that piece. Let's work out how that's going to happen now. So from a strategic perspective, I made a number of very core decisions around the technology and why I'm going to use those platforms. Now what I need to do is go back and refine the architecture. So we've taken a look at some of the tooling. And one of the things we're starting to see around some of these rapid development frameworks is they're GUI based. They drive the architecture around the GUI, not around good software engineering principles. So that's going to be a bit of a challenge for us in terms of how we start to go back and rethink that whole engineering approach. So we started to think about this in terms of a MVC framework. So we mandated MVC for the architecture, for the front end. But also now we're mandating a management framework that manages the various components that we're going to drop in that architecture. So we're going to make it slightly more complex than it needs to be to enable us to leverage future advances in the way in which we drop those components in. And of course, alongside that, we need to go back and rethink security, because that's going to be quite important in terms of the way we're thinking about trust. So there's been a fairly sort of rigorous process that we've followed, at least we like to think it's rigorous, in terms of why we've got and made some of those decisions as we move down the pipe. So we came to an architecture that we've now nailed and said this is the way we're going to go. But then if you start to overlay the principles that we're thinking about in terms of componentization and responsive web design, the question we're asking now is, how much do we stretch the technology to make it work? So for instance, anybody tried to do component design in JavaScript? Easy, isn't it? Really easy. So there's a question here about how far you take your programming techniques and re-engineer them. How far you take a programming language that was designed for one thing and really stretch it somewhere else. And this is one of the big debates at the moment is, can you overlay a paradigm over top of a language for which it wasn't originally intended? I've sort of done it, but it's a bit messy. It's not, you know, JavaScript is not Objective-C, it's not Java. It's not a componentized language, but you can do it. The question is it the right thing to do? We need to think about a bit more about agile delivery. Because it's great building a platform that's agile, and it's great building an architecture that's agile. If it takes 2 years to get the process through the organization, not the right thing. So you've got to re-engineer your process internally. Something we're working on at the moment. Your security's got to be flexible. Tokens and security changes all the time. The strength that you need to bring in changes all the time. You can't hard code that into your architecture. So you've got to build something else on the outside of that. If you're in responsive web design, your components are context aware. They understand the device, they understand the size of the screen, they understand the capabilities on the device. And they'll operate differently depending on what that looks like. And then you might want to do something like support for client mashups. So for me, the ideal scenario with a banking app for me would be I've got an application, it's got data in it, I put it on my iPad, I've got a spreadsheet on the iPad, I load the data into the spreadsheet, I do my financial planning, and away I go. I can do that on Android. Can't do it on an iPad though. I can't exchange data between apps on an iPad. So there's a whole load of things that start to break the way in which we're looking at this architecture again that we're going to have to go back and have a little bit of a think about. So there's a little bit of refinement about that overall process. So I think for me at the moment, the real question is how much we stretch this. And part of it is getting the developers to understand paradigms they're not used to. So when we've got a whole load of JavaScript programmers who've never met an object-oriented language and you start talking about component concepts, do they get it? No. Because you've got the wrong skill set. Sorry.
That's really changed quite a lot. I mean, now everyone's angry.
Yeah.
I don't like code from scratch. Who's the jQuery?
Yeah, that's right. So you've got some frameworks you can import into that. Unless, like me, occasionally you want to get down to the low level and work out exactly what's going on because it doesn't quite fit. And then you lift the lid and you go, maybe we lifted the lid on a Sensor Touch application. It doesn't look like JavaScript. It looks like something completely different. So I think that's part of the challenge at the moment is we're in a position where some of the dominant technologies don't necessarily do the things that we want them to. And how we start to stretch them. Yeah. So if you've got a browser on a mobile phone, you can't always guarantee a decent network connection. And we've tried downloading apps that have a significant dynamic HTML content, and it's just not a good user experience. Yeah, but you want to maintain a yeah. Not necessarily. If you think about, I mean, at the end of the day, it will be a payment you want to initiate off the back of the phone. But a lot of it might be just information about balances. You're going shopping, how much money have I got? If you want to transfer money between accounts because you're going to use your debit card or not, yeah, you will cache data on that. Yeah, yeah. Don't talk to me about PayPal or V.me. I haven't gone there yet. That's a whole new world, because the problem is we can put a whole load of apps on a phone and all the competitors are coming in at the side, like PayPal and Visa with V.me and their own wallets. Yeah. But you can't, the challenge at the moment is you can't integrate it all on the phone. And there's a very key thing here about once you get into these technologies, as a company when you're developing for these, what's the real big problem? You don't own the landscape. You don't own the real estate. Somebody else owns that. Unless you partner up and buddy up, you're not really going to get what you want out there. The biggest block to NFC-based payments on a mobile phone is not the technology. It's working with the MNOs. Because everybody wants to share the cake. And if you don't get the cost model right, nobody will use it. At the moment, everybody's fighting for that same real estate. And this is one of the challenges with some of these newer technologies, certainly for my domain, is you're working with partners because you don't own that piece that's out there. And this is a real challenge when you're trying to put technologies out onto a platform, that actually you've got to negotiate those technologies out there too. And if you're in the internet world, everybody has a browser on their phone, that's fine. But once you start setting the mobile apps, you get into mobile payments, you get a real problem in terms of who owns what out there. And everybody's after the same piece of landscape. That makes it quite hard.
Have you looked at the economics, for instance, if you want to standardize? If you do that whole life cycle.
You want the banking industry to standardize?
Well, no, it's like your customers to standardize on your application.
Yeah.
Have you looked at the economics of actually giving the customers first?
At the moment, the problem is you're forcing people onto a platform where there's a huge level of consumerization at the moment. And people are very precious about their mobile device. Far more than you'd think about. They will carry two phones, but they'll always have a preference. You know, this is why bring your own device, for instance, is probably the biggest issue with BlackBerry is they've had the corporate market. If corporates go bring your own device, how many people are going to go out and buy a BlackBerry? It's an interesting problem in terms of how you run the landscape.
One of the issues we've seen is on desktop platforms. We've now got APSG
Yeah.
running, which has moved up from 4K to 8K. And some of the small platforms can't build 8K headers.
No.
That's also a lot of traffic just to get ahead of it.
Yeah. And it's changing all the time. And really the thing that drives this is fundamentally consumerization. And don't underestimate consumerization when you're an enterprise architect. So I walked into an organization a couple of years ago and we were asked to go and have a look at their management information issue that they had. And we saw two problems. We originally described it as capitalism and communism, but that turned out to be very unpopular with the CIO. So we called it consumerism and socialism, which also turned out to be unpopular with the CIO, but we couldn't think of anything else. And that was the rise of end-user computing. And what we were seeing in the organizations is that the classic MI function within the organization was very slow, very well engineered, but very difficult to get functionality out. And typically an MI project would last about 12 to 18 months. So what grew up around it? An entire community of managing data across the organization with the business themselves. And they had the tools and they could get the data. And that turned out, in the end, when we looked at the stats, 80% of the MI was driven by the end-user computing stuff, not the official IT MI structure within the organization. Now, you could go and fight it, and you would look like King Canute. Or you could go and embrace it and try and engineer it to a level of suitability, which is the approach that we took. Because you can't get in the way of it. Don't underestimate the power of consumerism. And it's getting more driven by social media, social networking, people being used to do what they want to do in the market. So the power of the consumer in this is actually all, and will kill you every time if you're not careful. So you're absolutely right. You could go and give everybody a mobile phone, but if they don't like it, They won't use it. Yeah. Or whatever else it is they come up with, or pluggable.
David, could I argue that by adopting a hybrid architecture, you're actually moving yourself to build what is effectively another middleware platform?
Yeah, absolutely.
And past experience with middleware platforms is they're really nice to begin with, and they're really a pain later on because you have to maintain them.
Yeah.
So, once you have sort of fixed, so how much of a worry is that?
Huge. And that's always going to be the case with these types of platforms. I mean, the other thing that's interesting in this space is very much if you think about, again, consumer behavior, how many people here download apps onto their phone? How many people here download apps onto their PC? How many people have got Windows 8? You're going to be driving apps onto your PC in the next couple of years, so you'll be downloading them because that's the way the market's going to move. So if you're already in this idea of you're comfortable downloading small bits of code onto your devices, how long before you're using apps on your phone instead of a website? So again, the way in which the culture changes in this market is huge, and it has a huge ramifications for the way in which the organisations work. So if you're thinking about strategy and the data that you collect, you now have to collect a whole lot of data around social media. How many people here work for an organisation where social media is regarded as an asset? It's good to see. Nothing over that side, lots over that side. Yeah. Because that in itself dictates the way in which your business strategy will move. So if you're not monitoring, if you're not participating in those social channels, and you haven't got the technology that allows you to manage and monitor those, you're not going to be there in the future. Don't underestimate the power of the consumer in this new modern society. I think that's the right term. And there's some very good examples coming out there, certainly for the banks to sit up and take notice around the power of that consumerist approach. And you see that within mobile, we've seen it within the organisation itself, where you see communities latching onto something that gives them what they want quickly, and they won't let it go. And as an enterprise architect, you can sit there and go, right, you stop, you can't do your own MI anymore, you're going to go back over there to this wonderfully engineered but incredibly slow and incredibly expensive platform. How long would I last in the room? 30 seconds if I'm lucky. Because that's where people sit now. So for me, this particular market is where we're in hybrid, but we're actually developing a lot in HTML5. So if you think about what I said before, is I said I'm taking a risk reduction approach, and I am hedging my bets.
We're doing an internet application, and now we want to be on the iPad.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Worry about it. Browser detect poetry.
Yeah. Bit of CSS the way you go.
That is rather than having two parallel developments.
Yeah. But it also changes the way you think about your processes. So one of the things we've started to think about in terms of these lean connected processes, typically with an organization, you find the internal processes that service the customer and the external web processes that service the customer are different. And you make the external ones really easy to use and flexible because they hit the customer. What do you do with the internal ones? Oh, you can have that thing over there, that works. So why not use the external ones internally? Because actually people learn those on their own. So you change the way you think about the process architecture across the organization because you've got the opportunity now to take those processes and put them out in front of your colleagues as well. So it's driving big change, I think, across these organizations because you're thinking more generally about how these things can be reused and what impact that has on the overall business. It also means that you change the shape of the enterprise. So I suppose this is where the enterprise architect bit comes in. So for instance, if I'm talking to my channels people about what a lean process looks like, they say it's straight through processing. Make things simple. If I talk to my back office people about lean process, they say automate my processes. Because actually they think about running the process and making it easy for them to do, not get rid of the process. Because if I get rid of the process, what else do I get rid of? Them, the person that's doing it. So you've got to be very aware of, when you're starting to look at the technology and you start to look at the way in which that technology is driving the business, you make a big change to the way in which those functions work. If I put everything on a mobile, which I'm probably going to do, what does that do to the branch? What does the branch do? You can get your balances, you can get your statements, you can do cash, you can go to a cash machine to get your money out. What do you go to a branch for? Yeah. But it's now getting connected to this change of the high street. So we joke about the HMV bit, but actually the high street is changing. And that creates another thing you need to think about in terms of your technology strategy. Anybody seen the pictures of Virgin Bank's new branches? There's a piano in there. Not seen anybody play one yet, but so you see the new pictures of Virgin Bank. They've got pianos and comfy chairs. It's a bit like a sketch from Monty Python, you know. The comfy chair is in there. So this is still driving that change, and the question is, where does your technology strategy sit within that in terms of how you drive what it is you're going to bet your horse on for the next 5 or 6 years to drive that organisation? And you've seen so many people now fall foul of that. I was talking to a client, in fact, last week, and they'd done some analysis about the top 50 most successful companies in the world in the last 5 years. And guess what? They're all companies that think they deal with technology. Whether they're a clothes manufacturer, whether they're a bank or whatever, they all see themselves as a technology company, first and foremost, not a product company off the back of it. That's an interesting mindset change. Because they've all now started to recognise it's that successful implementation of technology that's driving that business model.
But also, I think a lot of them, I mean, think about, successful clothes manufacturers, end-to-end supply chain to China back and all that.
Yeah.
It's actually C2M that drove that through.
Yeah.
Supply chain management. And technology enabled the C2M.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that next phase. The real challenge is I don't think I know what it's going to look like.
Just an observation about the high school. 3 years ago, I went to
And you go and buy it.
They had bought they bought a company that sold it, so they wanted an internet company.
Yeah.
So the branch that I went to. And that's again.
What people forget about some of these technologies is you all joke about things like the Go Compare TV ad, where everyone's going to shoot the guy, but actually you can do so much comparison so quickly it changes the commercial model. We're in a nice position at the moment is that you can go and look at a bank account and you can compare them, but then it's very difficult to go elsewhere because there's a limited number of organisations that provide them. But that will change.
You're building a system for business mobile apps. How do you make the decision of building your own custom system versus
Yeah, so it's about product and brand and the experience you want to put in front of a customer. And this is one of those areas where we decided that we didn't want anybody else to dictate the customer experience. And the thing that's still important is getting the high rating in the app stores. So your customer experience off the end of this is really important. So that was a major decision for us, was actually we thought two things. One is, as an organisation, we tend to buy a lot. We do buy a lot of technology. We don't build it. This was the one area we thought we needed to innovate, and we would build and not buy. Just because we thought that was going to give us the best value. So it's an interesting sort of conundrum for me, because I'm going back and stretching my programming language knowledge again and understanding how we sort of stretch these technologies. And whether or not it's really worth doing, because I've got to build a business case around this. I can't just go and say, I think it's a really good thing to do and everybody's going to believe me. I've got to put some facts behind it. But it's very difficult to explain to people just how complex the environment that we're dealing with here is. And the sorts of, and you've obviously had the same problem is, you can take a risk-averse approach and you can bet your bottom dollar on hybrid and HTML5 and everything else. And guess what? Sitting around the corner is the next big disruptor. And it could really hit you quite hard. You know, I could find myself being the next species of dinosaur. So if I've only seen a meteor coming around the corner, let me know, because I'd certainly like to duck before it hits me.
On your first slide, very first slide, you were talking about space traffic.
Yeah.
But then you come on to this problem of risk reduction. I thought this going a bit practical, you know, a bit like designing an aircraft that could fly for 20 years. But I mean, are these really like designing that, or is it just trying not to be snookered? Keep the options open?
This is about keeping your options open. So one of the key drivers that we sort of divined from actually doing the initial analysis at the enterprise level was, you can't guarantee a technology, so you've got to be agile. But actually agile then means we're not just driving a technology picture through the organization, we're driving a cultural change through the organization. That's a big difference. So one of our key mantras here is agility. But that is technology, that's process, that's people, that's doing requirements differently with the business. It has a huge knock-on effect to what sits across the organization. And it creates another cultural issue, which is interesting, is if you're going to be innovative in the market, what's the one thing you should be aware that you could do on a regular basis? You could fail. If you innovate, you set yourself up to fail. I've not worked in a financial institution that's ever run a project where they've said, well, it might work, it might not, it might fail. It's a big cultural change, and it means you've got to be agile because you've got to reduce the cost if you're going to take that sort of risk. Otherwise, what happens is you do spend 2 years doing the research and the analysis to make sure that will fly in the market. By the time you've done that, the opportunity's gone. Yeah, so we're looking at it from the point of view of, can we move quickly enough for the next thing that we're going to have to deliver? And at the same time, are we delivering enough for the business that actually it's a usable application that people like you would go out and use? And that's the best value. It's a compromise. I don't know. We are. I think, from the point of view of enterprise architecture, and I know that you've blogs and everything else talk about this. There's a generation of people that sit in the senior positions in these organisations who have a skill set that isn't being duplicated and replicated coming up from the people that sit behind us, and that is a massive, massive problem. And we've been talking a little bit about the idea of bringing back in apprenticeships. So the idea that, to be an enterprise architect, you've got to do 10 years on-the-job training with a whole lot of training that goes around it. So you've got to change the way the market works. And we've started to talk, I know David's working with Fialpo on what that might look like, but fundamentally one of the things that I'm involved in at the moment is the whole idea of certification and accreditation and what it looks like, because you're not seeing the skill sets come through. And that's the real challenge. Because all the offshore stuff is out in India. The people aren't getting the development skills they used to get. The range of devices, the range of technologies is really huge. And there's not that many people that can have a fairly broad conversation with a number of technologies, rather than just people who've grown up with a very narrow slice of things that exist out there. So the real issue for me with enterprise architecture is, do you really have the broad enough skill set to do it? And you're absolutely right. The real problem is, there's a sort of a number of people coming through of a particular generation who know have got the skill sets to do it, and then there's a big vacuum behind. That's a real worry. Well, it is when I retire anyway, but up till now it's kept me in jobs, so I suppose I quite like that. I quite like the vacuum because it keeps me working.
Talking of retirement, I think we need to focus
Yeah.
this evening. I got a feeling that your next slide says questions.
It does indeed say questions, yeah.
We just had a very good discussion with both. Are there any final questions that you've got to ask?
Loads.
Linking on to the skills discussion here. How can I build up a skill set in such a way that I can become an enterprise architect?
So I think you need to do what I did, which is basically you plan it very carefully. So you look at where you are today, you look at the skill set that you've got, and you say, what am I missing? And you've got to look at the senior people around you and say, what do they do differently to what I do? And some of it is technical training, some of it is non-technical training. A lot of it is, so for me, one of the things I find with enterprise architects that they do really badly is they don't read people very well. I sit in loads and loads of meetings where people come in and do a presentation and they blindly blast through the presentation. And they're not aware of the audience, not aware of that feedback. So you need to look at the skill sets that you've got and you say, well, actually, how do I get that? Where do I get that bit from? Where do I get that bit from? And build it up very gradually. Now, I didn't get here in 5 years. I got here in 32 years, which is a frightening thought. But so it does take time. And certainly when I set up a couple of EA practices, and you get people applying, you say, right, you're not good for the job yet. Why? You haven't done 15 years worth of experience. You haven't done 20 years worth of experience. You've got to have that to really understand the breadth of these technologies. That's the challenge. But plan it very carefully. I've planned mine very carefully.
But he has not been there in the market, but has not evolved since 2000. It's only taken us after 2000.
It's been around for a lot longer than that. I've been very careful. So I started life as a hardware engineer. I did 7 years as a mainframe engineer in ICL in the days when actually we had a computer industry. And I decided at the end of 7 years I didn't have the right skills to do the next bit. So I went back to university for a year, did an MSc. I studied computing formally, then decided that actually to get some of the other skills like presenting and everything else, I'd go and teach for a while. And that while turned out to be 12 years rather than the 1 or 2 that I thought I would do it for. And then gradually again, I've built that up and built that up. So you've really got to plan this whole thing out. You can't, it's not just going to happen. And if you plan it properly, the opportunities do arise. So you need to write down a big skill set and go, what have I got, what am I not good at? And be fairly honest with yourself. You can ask a question.
Yeah. From your point of view, how do you deal with ever-increasing budgets within a project?
Yeah.
Where you start with 5 million, then it's 4, then it's 3, then it's 2. Actually, we want what we asked for in the first place, we've only got 1.
Yeah, so for every project I deal with, I've always got 2 or 3 things I think I'll die in a ditch for. So it might be that I've got a bit of strategy and I said, they've got to deliver that little bit of it, but I don't care about the rest. So if it gets de-scoped, I don't care. So for me, it's about understanding the significant bits of the architecture that you're looking for. And then with the business, it will be sitting down and working out the significant bits of the functionality that you're looking for. But fundamentally, I'll always have 1 or 2 things that I go, well, we'll really die in a ditch for that. And I've died in a few. So that I think is part of it.
I think we've got to stop. But first of all, I want to thank David for giving a terrific discussion. The level of interaction. How good it's been. Okay, so could you please?
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And the second thing is, please sign this ready. Also going to go to Champagne Charlie Boybar,